The sun was a fist. It beat down on the dusty cattle pens of Socorro, in the New Mexico territory, hammering the stench of manure and fear into the dry air. It was 1870, and the war was over, but its shadows were long. For Lena, the sun was just another master. She stood on a low wooden block next to the auctioneer's stand, a place usually reserved for announcing the sale of prime breeding bulls. A heavy iron chain, slick with rust and sweat, linked her wrists. She was dirty. The calico dress she wore was stiff with alkali dust and old grime. She had been promised manumission papers in Tennessee, freedom, a piece of paper that said she owned herself. Instead, she had been sold in secret by a desperate overseer, moved west like contraband luggage, and passed from one hand to another until she landed here. The promise was a lie. Freedom was a ghost. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and whiskey on his breath, did not call her a slave. That was a word falling out of fashion, inconvenient after so much blood had been spilled to erase it.
"And now, gentlemen, a special lot,"
he bellowed, gesturing to Lena with a flourish.
"A long-term servant, fully bonded, strong back, healthy teeth, perfect for the barns or the kitchens.
Docile and trained. Who will start the bidding for this prime piece of help?" Lena kept her head bowed. She had learned the geometry of submission. Keep your eyes on the ground. Make yourself small. Do not meet their gaze. To meet their gaze was to challenge, and to challenge was to invite pain. Her wrists were already raw and bleeding where the iron had rubbed them open. The crowd of ranchers and cowboys barely cared. They were here for longhorns and horses. A woman, black and chained, was just a curiosity, a minor diversion before the real business began. They saw her as property, same as the saddles and mules.
$20,
a voice called out, mostly for sport.
30.
I see 30. Do I hear 40? She can cook. Gentlemen, mend your gear. $40 for a lifetime of service.
A new voice, cold and laced with amusement, cut through the low bids.
$100.
The crowd quieted. The voice belonged to Caleb Vorn. Vorn was a man who owned half the valley and acted like he owned the rest, including the air. He sat on a fine-looking stallion, wearing a clean duster and a flat-brimmed hat. He was wealthy, and the cruelty around his mouth was not hidden. It was worn like a badge. The auctioneer beamed.
$100 from Mr. Vorn, a keen eye for quality. Sir, going once, going twice, sold.
The gavel cracked like a gunshot. It was done. Vorn's overseer, a hard man with colorless eyes, moved to the block and grabbed the chain. He yanked it hard, pulling Lena off balance. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the dust. A ripple of laughter, thin and mean, went through the onlookers.
"Get up, girl,"
the overseer growled. Lena pushed herself up, her body aching, her mind floating somewhere far away. This was the only way to survive. You shut a door inside your head and you waited. It was then that Reed Carson arrived. He was not there for the auction. He was there to sell 3 strong-looking quarter horses he had brought down from the high country. He moved with a stiffness in his left leg, a half-healed limp from a piece of shrapnel at Antietam. Scars, pale and silvery, webbed his forearm where a cavalry saber had laid him open. He was a man made of old leather and quiet anger, his eyes the color of a washed-out sky. He was leading his horses toward the livery manager when he saw the scene at the block. He saw Vorn, smiling. He saw the overseer, and he saw Lena. He watched as the overseer gave the chain another vicious tug. Lena flinched, a movement so small it was almost invisible, a tightening of the shoulders, a sudden intake of breath. She flinched, but she made no sound. Something in Reed Carson snapped. It was not a conscious thought. It was a physical reaction, like touching a hot stove. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in the eyes of a gray-faced boy from Ohio, holding his own insides in his hands. He had seen it in the faces of prisoners staring through the stockade fence at Andersonville. It was the look of hopelessness, the look of a soul that had already surrendered to the grave, leaving only the body to suffer. It was a look he knew from the war, a look that had haunted his sleep for 5 long years. He hated the war. He hated the men who started it, the men who profited from it, and the waste of it all. He had fought for the Union, believed in the cause, until he saw that greed and cruelty wore blue coats just as easily as they wore gray. Now, he saw that same cruelty wearing a landowner's duster. He said nothing. He handed his horses over to the liveryman, collected his payment, and watched. He watched Vorn and his men lead Lena away, tethered to a saddle horn like a pack mule, toward Vorn's sprawling ranch house at the edge of town. Reed's business was done, but he did not leave Socorro. He went to the saloon, took a corner table, and nursed a single whiskey, his face grim and unreadable. He waited for night. The moon was a cold sliver in the sky when Reed moved. He left his horse saddled and tied in a dark alleyway, along with a second horse he had acquired, a fast mare with a gentle eye. He moved through the shadows with a hunter's silence, the limp barely slowing him. Vorn's ranch was dark, save for a single lamp in the main house and a lantern hanging in the stable. Reed bypassed the house. He knew where Vorn would keep her. A stable was for animals, and that is what Vorn had bought. He slipped inside the stable. The air was warm and smelled of hay and horses, in the lantern's weak glow. He saw a guard sitting on a stool, leaning against a stall door, a shotgun across his lap. The man was half asleep. Reed did not hesitate. He picked up a heavy wooden yoke from the wall, stepped behind the man, and brought it down hard across the back of his neck. The guard crumpled without a sound, a sigh escaping his lips. Reed took the shotgun and the man's pistol. He found Lena in the last stall, the one reserved for sick animals. She was chained to an iron ring on the wall. She was not asleep. She sat upright, her back against the rough wood, watching the shadows. When Reed stepped into the stall, she did not cry out. She simply watched him, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light. Reed knelt and used the butt of his pistol to break the lock on her chains. The heavy links fell away from her wrists with a dull clatter. Her wrists were raw. Dark blood caked on the skin. She rubbed them, her face a mask of disbelief and suspicion. "Who are you?" she whispered. Her voice was rough, like dry leaves. "Name's Reed." He looked toward the main house. "Vorn in there?" She just stared. He had no time for this. He pulled the extra pistol from his belt, the guard's pistol, and checked the load. He held it out to her. "Butt first. You know how to use one of these?" She shook her head, pulling away from the weapon. "He'll be in the main house," Reed muttered, more to himself. He turned to leave the stall, then paused. He looked back at her. She had not moved. She was free of the chain, but she was still imprisoned in that stall. "I'm going to see Vorn," he said, his voice low and flat. "You can stay here. Wait for him or his men to find you in the morning. Or you can come with me. I won't make you. But you best decide right now." Lena looked at the open stall door. She looked at the raw skin on her wrists. She looked at this strange, scarred white man who had appeared like a phantom. Staying was a known hell. Vorn's amused eyes promised a life of misery. This man was the unknown. He was a gunshot in the dark, a sheer cliff edge. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest. After a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, she slowly, deliberately, pushed herself to her feet. She gave a single, curt nod. It was enough. Reed motioned for her to follow. They found Vorn in his study, a decanter of whiskey in one hand, a cigar in the other. He was counting money under a bright oil lamp. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise, not fear. "What in the hell?" Reed did not speak. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his limp pronounced, and laid the barrel of his pistol against Vorn's chest, right over the heart. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafeningly loud in the quiet room. Vorn's amusement vanished, replaced by the pale, sweaty look of a man who saw his own death. She's not your property, Reed said, his voice barely a rasp.
Not anymore.
He did not wait for an answer. He grabbed the stack of money Vorn had been counting, his own horse money. He figured, and then some, and stuffed it into his saddlebag. He motioned to Lena, who was standing in the doorway like a ghost. Let's go. He backed out of the room, the pistol never wavering from Vorn's chest. He pulled the door shut, and they ran. They were on the horses and riding out of the ranch yard before Vorn found the courage to shout. A moment later, a gunshot echoed from the house, fired wildly into the night, but they were already gone, 2 shadows swallowed by the vast, dark wildland. The night wind was bitter and sharp, cutting through Lena's thin dress. She rode the mare Reed had given her, clutching the saddle horn with both hands, her body swaying with the animal's powerful gait. She did not know how to ride well, but the horse seemed to understand, keeping pace with Reed's stallion. Reed set a punishing pace, pushing south and west, away from the town, away from the river, into the high desert. The land was open and empty, a dead sea under a sliver of moon. Lena barely spoke. She did not ask where they were going. She did not ask who he was or what he wanted. She had been free before, and it had led her to an auction block. This new, violent freedom felt no different. It was just another man, another horse, another set of orders. She did not trust him. She did not trust the horse beneath her. She did not trust the word freedom. Not yet. They rode for hours, until the horses were slick with sweat and blowing hard. Reed finally pulled up in a deep, dry arroyo, a scar in the earth that offered cover from the wind and from searching eyes. He swung down from his horse, his limp obvious now that the adrenaline was fading. He moved stiffly, tending to the animals first, rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass, whispering to them in a low voice. Lena slid from the horse, her legs trembling. She landed hard and nearly fell. She leaned against the sandy bank of the arroyo, watching him. Reed built a small fire, a true cowboy fire, using dry sticks that would burn hot and smokeless, tucked under an overhang to hide the glow. The small flames licked at the darkness, offering a tiny circle of warmth. Lena stayed on the edge of the light, huddled into herself, watching him with a guarded, silent intensity. She was a hawk, watching a snake, unsure if it was a threat or just another creature sharing the same patch of dirt. He opened his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of dried jerky and a water skin. He walked over to her and held them out. She stared at the food, then at his face. His expression was hidden by the shadow of his hat. Slowly, she took them. The jerky was tough and salty. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. He went back to his saddle, pulled off his bedroll, and unfastened it. He took out the single, heavy wool blanket. He walked back to her and offered that, too. "Take it," he said. "Night gets cold out here." She took the blanket, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough, calloused, and steady. The blanket smelled of dust, leather, and faintly of him. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the wool scratching her chin. Reed went back to the other side of the small fire. He checked his pistol, lay his saddle down as a pillow, and stretched out on the cold sand, facing away from her. Within minutes, his breathing evened out, though Lena knew he was not truly asleep, but listening. She did not sleep. She sat by the fire, clutching the heavy blanket, and watched the flames. She watched the man who had stolen her. He had knocked out a guard, put a pistol to a rich man's chest, and ridden off with her as if he were stealing a horse. He had given her food, water, and his only blanket, and then he had turned his back. It meant nothing, or it meant everything. She was too tired to know the difference. The desert that followed was cruel. The days were a blinding white hell. The nights a freezing, whispering black. There was no water. The shade was sparse, offered only by skeletal mesquite trees or the sharp edges of boulders. They traveled cautiously, Reed avoided all roads, all towns. He followed game trails, skirted high ridges to keep from being silhouetted against the sky, and crossed open ground only in the gray twilight of dawn and dusk. He was a man who knew how to be hunted. Lena walked as much as she rode. The mare was strong, but the ground was hard. She would slide off and walk beside the horse, her feet wrapped in rags Reed had torn from his own spare shirt. He would dismount and walk beside her, his limp a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to her stride. They moved in a bubble of silence. The only sounds, the grit of their boots on the rocks and the weary sighs of the horses. Lena revealed nothing of her past. She did not speak of the plantation in Tennessee, of the husband she had lost, or of the promise of freedom that had turned to ash in her mouth. That part of her life was a box, nailed shut and buried deep. Reed, in turn, offered little of himself. But on the third day, as they rested the horses in the shadow of a granite cliff, he spoke. "Fought with the Union," he said, staring out at the shimmering heat. "Saw a lot of men die. Left the army disgusted. Been drifting ever since." He was offering an explanation, a reason, why he had seen her and acted. He saw the war in her, the same sickness he felt in himself. Lena just nodded, absorbing the information. It made him no less dangerous, but perhaps it made him different. That evening, as the sun bled out over the western mesas, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and blood orange, Reed asked the first real question. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. "I can head north toward Colorado, or west. Makes no difference to me." Lena looked at the vast, empty land around them. It was a prison with no walls. North, south, west, they were just directions. They were not freedom. She had no map, no destination. She had only one: burning need. She turned her gaze to him. Her eyes were no longer numb. They were hard, like the country they were in. "I do not care where we go," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "Just do not take me back. Just do not take me back." The words hung in the cold night air, a plea that was also a boundary. Reed Carson looked at her across the dying fire. In her eyes, he saw the embers of a will that had been banked but not extinguished. He had seen men broken by far less. He simply nodded, accepting her terms. It was the only answer he had. The days that followed fell into a harsh and fragile rhythm, dictated by the sun and the scarcity of water. The New Mexico territory was a brutal, beautiful anvil, and they were two small pieces of iron upon it. Their mornings began before dawn, in the gray, bloodless light that came before the sun. Reed would rise first, his movements stiff from the cold ground and his old wound. He would check the horses, his hands moving over their legs and flanks with a practiced gentleness. He would scout the ridgeline, his eyes sweeping the horizon for any sign of dust, any movement that was not wind or animal. Only when he was satisfied would he return to the camp. Lena would already be awake. She never seemed to sleep deeply. She would be sitting, the heavy wool blanket still wrapped around her, watching him. She looked, he thought, like a rabbit frozen in the grass, ready to bolt at the first sign of a hawk. On the first morning after that camp, he had offered her the reins to his own stallion, a calmer, stronger beast than the mare. "He has a smoother gait," Reed said. "Be easier riding?" Lena had looked at the reins, then at him. She shook her head and moved to the mare, her back straight. "I will walk." "It is a long way. No sense in both of us walking." "I will walk," she repeated. Her voice was flat, not defiant, but absolute. Reed understood. It was not about the ride. It was about the debt. She would not ride while he walked. She would not be cargo, tended and protected like a fragile piece of luggage. She had been property yesterday. Today, she would be a traveler, equal in her misery and in her effort. So, he walked beside her. He would lead his stallion, and she would lead the mare, or sometimes she would walk unbound, her hands chafing her own raw wrists, her head high. They covered fewer miles this way. But a strange, unspoken respect formed in the dust that rose from their boots. Neither wanted charity. Both understood the cost of pride. Their meals were silent affairs. A strip of jerky chewed slowly, a handful of dry biscuits from his saddlebag, shared equally. When the water in his canteen ran low, he gave it to her. She drank, then handed it back. Leaving half, he drank the rest, and their eyes met over the warm metal. She began to speak, but only of the essential.
"Firewood is scarce here,"
she would observe, her voice quiet, scanning the barren hills. "We are low on water. That canteen is lighter. I saw tracks by the creek bed. Deer, I think, moving east." Reed was startled by her sharpness. She missed nothing. She saw the flick of a lizard's tail at 20 paces, the turn of a hawk's wing in the high air. She had survived by watching, by anticipating the whims and rages of those who owned her. Now, she was using those same skills to survive the wild. He, in turn, spoke of the land. "That kind of rock," he pointed, "means water is deep, if there is any. Do not bother digging. See the way the grass is bent? Something heavy came through here, probably cattle. We go the other way." One night, the silence stretched longer than usual. The fire was a small pulse of orange in a vast, cold darkness. The stars were so bright they seemed to be screaming. Lena stared into the flames, her face unreadable.
"I had a name once,"
she said, so softly Reed thought he had imagined it. He stopped cleaning his pistol, his hands freezing on the oiled rag. He waited.
"It was Sarah,"
she whispered.
Before I was sold the first time."
She did not say more. She did not explain who had given her the name Lena, or what had happened to Sarah. She did not have to. Reed understood that Sarah was the name of a person, and Lena was the name of a possession. By telling him, she was handing him a small, sharp piece of her soul. "Sarah," he repeated. He said it quietly, tasting the sound of it. "It is a good name." She nodded, once, and pulled the blanket tighter. The conversation was over. The next day, he made a decision. Vorn would not just let this go. He would send men. A landowner's pride was a dangerous thing, and Lena, she was valuable property. The men who came would not be gentle. He pulled the guard's pistol from his saddlebag. It was smaller than his own Colt, a pocket revolver, easier to handle. He held it out to her.
"You need to know how to use this."
She recoiled, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. "I do not like them. The sound—" "I do not care if you like it," Reed said, his voice flat, not unkind. "Liking it has nothing to do with it. The world does not care what you like. It only cares what you can do. You cannot rely on me to be there every second. You cannot rely on anyone. You must rely on this." He pushed it into her hand. Her fingers were stiff and cold as she wrapped them around the grip. Her whole arm trembled. "It is heavy," she whispered. "You will get used to it." He spent an hour with her. He showed her how to load the chambers, how to thumb the hammer, how to aim, not with one eye squeezed shut, but with both eyes open. "Do not pull the trigger," he instructed. "Squeeze it, like you are squeezing a lemon, slow and steady. Surprise yourself when it goes off." He set a small, dried piece of cactus on a rock. "Try—" She raised the pistol. It shook violently. Her eyes were squeezed shut. She jerked the trigger. The shot was a sharp crack, deafening in the silence, and the bullet kicked up dust 5 feet to the left. The recoil slammed her hand back, and she dropped the pistol, stepping away from it as if it were a snake. She was breathing hard, her hands at her mouth. "Again," he said. He picked it up and handed it back.
"I cannot—"
"Yes, you can." His voice was hard, the voice of a man who had seen worse. "You can, because the alternative is letting some man like Vorn, or his overseer, drag you back. You want that?" She stared at him, her chest heaving. Slowly, she took the pistol. She shot again and again. She missed every time, but the shaking lessened. Her eyes stayed open. When the gun was empty, she stood, her arm aching. But she had not dropped it. "Good enough for now," he said, taking it from her. "We cannot waste more bullets." That evening, he managed to snare a rabbit. He brought it back to the camp, a small, gray bit of meat that meant a hot meal. He pulled his skinning knife. Lena watched him. "You should know this too," he said. He sat on a rock and motioned her closer. She knelt beside him, her face tense. He showed her how to make the first cuts, how to work the skin free from the muscle, how to do it quickly, cleanly. "You have to be careful here, around the stomach," he explained, his voice low. "You cut that, you spoil the meat." His large, scarred hand covered hers, guiding the knife. Her skin was cold. His was rough. It was a simple, practical thing. He was teaching her, but as his thumb brushed the back of her hand, a current passed between them, sharp and sudden as static electricity. Lena's breath hitched. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. It was a look that lasted only a second, but it changed the air between them. It was a look of pure, animal awareness. He was a man. She was a woman. They were alone, under a sky that did not care, and their bodies knew it, even if their minds refused. Reed pulled his hand away first, as if burned. He cleared his throat. "Like that," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "You finish it?" He stood up and walked away to check the horses, his heart pounding a strange, guilty rhythm against his ribs. Their bond was growing, but it was a strange thing, built on the silences, on the shared burden of survival, and on a respect that neither of them had ever expected to find. They were two halves of a broken whole, fitting together in ways that frightened them both. Reed wrestled with it every night. When it was his turn to watch, he would sit by the fire and look at her sleeping form. She slept curled tight, like a fist, one hand near her face. He would see the raw, dark marks on her wrists, stark against her skin in the moonlight. He had rescued her, but the act felt violent. He had taken her at gunpoint. He had used the same force Vorn would have used. He had told himself it was to save her, but the ugly word kept coming back to him. Possession. He had taken Vorn's possession, and now she was with him. Worse, he would look at the line of her throat, the curve of her hip under the wool blanket, and he would feel a pull, a deep, male longing that was as natural as breathing and as shameful as sin. He wanted her. He wanted to touch her in a way that had nothing to do with teaching her how to skin a rabbit. He would feel the desire, and then a wave of self-loathing would wash over him. To want her like that, did it make him any different from Vorn? Did he save her only to want to own her himself? He would stand up and walk to the edge of the camp, staring into the darkness, fighting a war inside himself that was as bitter as any he had fought in Tennessee. They were 2 weeks out, pushing north toward the San Juan Mountains. When the weather turned, the flat, iron-gray sky that had threatened them for days finally broke. It was not a gentle rain. It was a cold, driving deluge, a sheet of icy water that turned the dry arroyos into churning brown rivers within an hour. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled, a physical force that tried to rip the clothes from their backs. "We have to find shelter," Reed yelled over the roar of the storm. "The horses will not last in this." Lena was soaked to the bone, her thin dress clinging to her, her body shaking so violently she could barely hold the reins. She just nodded, her face pale and pinched. Reed had been following an old Ute trail, hoping to find a line shack he remembered. But through the gray sleet, he saw something else, a dark shape, a smudge of ruin against the hillside. There! It was a ghost town, a small, failed mining settlement that the desert was busy reclaiming. Most of the buildings were just foundations, skeletal remains, but one, on the edge of the collapse, still stood, mostly. A large livery stable. Its roof caved in on one side, but the other half still offered a dark, dry space. They half led, half dragged the horses inside. The animals steamed and shivered, their ears laid back. The barn was a wreck of collapsed beams and rotting hay, but it was dry. Reed led the horses into the most stable-looking stalls and began rubbing them down with handfuls of dry, musty straw. Lena stood just inside the doorway, water streaming from her. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, a painful, clicking sound. "You have to get out of those clothes," Reed said, his voice tight with alarm. "You will freeze." He went to his saddle, unstrapped his bedroll, and pulled out his dry coat. It was a heavy sheepskin, worn and stained, but it was dry. He held it out to her. She looked at the coat, then at him, her eyes clouded with cold and fear. "Go on," he said, his voice rough. "Back there, in the stall. Get that dress off. Put this on." He was a man giving an order. She hesitated. "Now, Lena," he said, "this is not a request. You will die of cold." The hardness in his voice finally broke through her frozen state. She took the coat and disappeared into the shadows of an empty stall. Reed turned his back. He deliberately made himself busy with the horses, checking a hoof, adjusting a feed bag he did not have. He could hear her moving, the sound of wet cloth peeling from skin, a sharp intake of breath as the cold air hit her. He was a man. He was human. The guilt from his nightly vigils warred with the raw, simple fact of her presence. He told himself not to. He commanded himself not to. But he looked back. He turned his head, just slightly. It was dark in the barn, but in the gray, stormy light from the door, he saw her. She was turned away from him, her back to him as she struggled with the wet dress. He saw the sharp line of her spine, the vulnerable curve of her shoulders, her dark skin slick with rain. She was just a woman, cold and exposed. And in that same instant, she must have felt his eyes on her. She froze. Then slowly, she looked back over her shoulder. She saw him. She saw him looking. Lena did not scream. She did not cry out. She did not scramble to cover herself, as he had expected. She just held his gaze. Her eyes were dark, and in them, he saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else. A question. A deep, painful, human acknowledgement. Reed turned away, his face burning with a shame so hot it eclipsed the cold. He felt like Vorn. He felt like the lowest kind of man. "I am sorry," he muttered to the horse. A moment later, she emerged from the stall. The sheepskin coat was huge on her, swallowing her. It hung to her knees, the sleeves rolled up, but she was no longer shaking as badly. They built a fire in the middle of the stable's wide floor. In a clear patch of dirt, the storm raged outside, a screaming, violent thing. Inside, the small fire was their only anchor. They sat for a long time, saying nothing. The tension from that stolen look was thick in the air, a third presence in the barn. Reed stared at the fire. Lena stared at her hands. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely louder than the wind. "Why?" Reed looked up. "Why what?" "Why did you take me?" It was the question that had been hanging between them since the first night. He had given her a soldier's answer before. Now, she needed the human one. He looked at her. Her face was half in shadow, her eyes reflecting the small flames. He owed her the truth, the simple, ugly, complicated truth. "I told you I was in the war." He rubbed his scarred forearm. I saw things. Men doing things to other men, to women. I saw what happens when one person decides another person is not human, that they are just a thing to be used, or broken, or sold. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the gray in his hair. "When I saw Vorn's man hit you, and you flinched, and that crowd, they just laughed. Or they did not see. They did not see you. They just saw a thing on a block." He met her gaze, his own full of a bleak, tired anger. I guess I just got tired of watching. I got tired of no one doing anything. He let out a long breath. I took you, Lena, because no one else would. It was a simple answer. It was not heroic. It was not a grand speech about freedom. It was just a fact. A single, decent act in a world full of indecency. Lena watched his face for a long time. She saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt. She saw the truth of his words. He was not Vorn. He was not her old master. He was just a man, as broken as she was. The storm howled, shaking the old beams of the barn. A gust of wind pushed icy rain through a crack, and Lena shivered, even in the heavy coat. Slowly, deliberately, she reached across the small space between them. She did not move her body. She just put her hand out, palm up, on the ground near his boot. Reed's breath caught. He looked at her hand. It was an invitation. It was a question. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever seen. He moved, shifting from his rock to sit on the hay-strewn dirt beside her. He did not touch her. She reached out again, her fingers trembling, and lightly, so lightly. She touched the back of his hand. His skin jolted at the contact. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. Her hand was small, cold, and rough with work. His was large, scarred, and shaking. His touch was reverent. They sat like that, holding hands, watching the fire. The cold was seeping in, a damp, bone-deep chill that the fire could not fight. Lena shivered again, a deep, racking tremor. Reed looked at his bedroll. A single blanket. He looked at her. "We will be warmer," he said, his voice thick. If we share the blanket." She looked at their joined hands, then at his face. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He spread his bedroll on a pile of dry, clean hay. Then he laid his saddle blanket down. It was not much. He sat, his back against a post, and held the wool blanket open. She moved beside him, settling into the hay, her back against the same post. She was stiff, her body tense. He draped the blanket over both of them, tucking it around her shoulders. It was not enough. The cold was too deep. "Lena," he said, his voice a whisper. She turned to him. He opened his arms. She paused, for a heartbeat that seemed to last a year. Then, slowly, she turned and pressed herself against his side. He wrapped the blanket and his arms around her. She was rigid in his embrace, a statue of ice. He could feel her shaking. He just held her, his chin resting on the top of her head. He smelled the rain in her hair, and the faint, dusty scent of straw. He did not move. He just held her, offering his warmth. Minutes passed. 10, 20, slowly, like a frozen branch thawing in the sun. The tension began to leak out of her. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a softer tremor. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the auction block. Her head, tentative at first, came to rest on his chest. He could feel her eyelashes, damp against his shirt. They lay like that, under the shared blanket, their bodies pressed together. It was not for pleasure. It was not for desire. It was for the aching, desperate need for human closeness. It was for warmth in a world that was fatally cold. It was not yet love. He did not know what it was, but as the storm raged outside and he held her, Reed knew one thing, and as Lena listened to the steady, quiet beat of his heart beneath her ear, she knew it, too. This was the first time she had been touched by a man, in a lifetime of being touched, without fear, and in the dark, collapsed barn. She did not sleep, but she rested. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. The morning light that filtered into the collapsed barn was pale, cold, and unforgiving. Lena and Reed separated from their embrace slowly, an awkwardness settling over them. The night had been about shared, desperate warmth, The day brought back the sharp edges of their reality. They were a white man and a black woman, fugitives, and the intimacy of the night, however practical, felt dangerous in the light. Reed rose first, his bad legs stiff and aching. He moved to the barn door, scanning the muddy, rain-washed landscape. The world was clean, but empty.
"We should move,"
he said, his voice rough.
This was a lucky find, but we cannot stay.
Lena was already on her feet. Folding the heavy wool blanket, she handed it to him, her eyes not quite meeting his. "Where?"
"North,"
he said, turning to saddle his stallion. "I know a man, Elias Thorne, runs a supply post for a mining camp up in the San Juans. He owes me a favor from a long time back. We can get lost there, get you some real clothes, a proper meal. Folks in mining camps tend to mind their own business." She nodded. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but the silence of two people who had shared something. They rode out of the ruined barn. Their horses rested and turned their faces toward the high peaks in the distance. They traveled for 3 more days, the land rising steadily, changing from high desert scrub to sparse grasslands. They needed supplies. The jerky was gone, and their ammunition was low. Reed knew they had to risk a stop. They came upon a small trading post, a lonely sod building near a muddy crossroads. It was too small to be a town, just a place for drifters and ranchers to buy flour and cartridges. "Wait here," Reed told Lena, stashing her and the horses in a deep, dry arroyo a 1/4 mile away. "Keep that pistol close. I will be quick." She watched him go, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Reed limped into the dim, dusty trading post. It smelled of cured tobacco, rancid bacon, and damp earth. 3 men in worn dusters nursed coffee at a small counter. The proprietor, a thin man with watery eyes, stood behind a plank bar. Reed asked for flour, coffee, and a box of .44 cartridges. As the proprietor turned to scoop the flour, Reed's eyes scanned the wall, and he saw it. It was a piece of paper, nailed next to a notice about livestock brands. It was a bounty poster. "Wanted," it read in thick black letters. "Reed Carson, for horse theft and the forcible theft of a servant. Accomplice to a runaway. $200. His blood ran cold. He felt a prickle on his neck. $200 was more than a man might make in half a year. It was enough to make a friend kill a friend. He glanced at the men at the counter. One of them, a gaunt man with a shotgun resting on his knees, was looking at him. The man's eyes flickered from Reed's face, down to his limping leg, then back to the poster. Reed kept his face impassive. He paid for his goods, his hands steady as he dropped the coins on the counter. He picked up the flour sack and the small parcel of coffee and cartridges. He turned to leave. "Hold on, mister," the gaunt man's voice rasped out. Reed stopped, but did not turn. "That poster by the door," the man said, standing up, the shotgun held loosely in his hands. "It looks an awful lot like you, and it mentions a runaway. I seen 2 sets of tracks heading this way." "A lot of men limp, friend," Reed said, his voice flat. He started walking again. "I said hold on." Reed heard the double click of the shotgun's hammers. He dropped the flour in one fluid, agonizing motion. He spun and drew his Colt. He did not aim to kill. He fired from the hip, the shot exploding in the small room. The bullet splintered the wooden counter, inches from the man's hand. The man yelled and dove for cover. "Stay down," Reed roared. He grabbed the flour sack, his bad legs screaming in protest, and bolted out the door. He heard shouts behind him, the sound of men scrambling for rifles. "Riders!" he yelled as he half fell, half slid into the arroyo. "We have to go, now! They know who we are!" Lena needed no other explanation. She was on her mare in an instant. They scrambled out of the arroyo and spurred the horses into a dead run, heading not for the road, but straight into the wilderness, toward the rising foothills. The pursuit was immediate. The men from the post were joined by others, drawn by the gunshot. They were bounty riders, professionals. They rode hard, and they rode smart. For 2 days, Reed and Lena fled. They rode until the horses were lathered and blowing, rested for an hour, and rode again. They skirted canyons and pushed through dense thickets of juniper, trying to break the trail, but the hunters were relentless. On the 3rd day, they were cornered. Reed had hoped to lose them in a network of canyons, but he had taken a wrong turn. They found themselves at the edge of a wide, shallow creek, its water running fast and cold from the high country melt. On the far side was a long, open slope of shale and sparse pine. Beyond that, the true mountains. But the riders were closing in. They could hear them, shouting in the canyons behind them. "We have to cross," Reed said, his face grim. "It is our only chance. They will be on us in minutes. We make for the trees on that slope. Go!" He spurred his stallion into the churning water. Lena was right beside him. The horses stumbled on the slick, rocky bottom, the icy water splashing up to their bellies. A gunshot cracked from the ridge behind them. The bullet whined past Reed's ear, a high-pitched, deadly song. "They are on the ridge!" Reed yelled. He was a perfect target, a man on a horse in the middle of a river. He fought his stallion, trying to get his rifle free from the scabbard, his back exposed. He was focused on the rifle, his body turned. He did not see the second rider, the one who had taken careful aim. Lena saw him. She saw the glint of the sun on the long rifle barrel. She saw the man steady his aim. "Reed!" she screamed. It was not a warning. It was a roar. She did not think. She reacted. She yanked the reins of her mare, driving the horse hard into Reed's stallion. Her shoulders slammed into his back. The impact knocked him clean out of the saddle. A second gunshot cracked the air. The bullet ripped through the space where Reed's chest had been a moment before. He and Lena both hit the water, a tangled mess of limbs. The icy shock stole their breath. The horses panicked, scrambled for the far bank. "Stay down," Reed gasped. Surfacing, he grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her against the near bank, using the 3-foot ledge of dirt as cover. The water was a numbing, violent force, trying to pull them under. He raised his pistol over the bank and fired 3 times toward the ridge. It was too far to hit, but it made the riders duck. "Move! Upstream! Now!" They crouched, sinking to their chests in the frigid water, and scrambled along the bank. Bullets kicked up mud around them. They moved 50 yards upstream, found a game trail, and clawed their way out. They grabbed the reins of their panicked horses, who were waiting on the far bank, and plunged into the deep, dark cover of the mountain pines. They were safe, for now. But they were in a new kind of hell. They were in the high country. The air was thin, the wind was a knife, and they were soaked to the bone. They had lost the flour, the coffee, and half their ammunition in the creek. That night, they made a cold camp under a thick spruce. They dared not light a fire. The smoke would be a beacon. Reed took their one remaining blanket, soaked but still wool, and wrapped it around them both. They huddled together, their bodies shaking in a violent, uncontrollable rhythm. Their teeth chattered so loudly it seemed to echo in the woods. You saved my life," Reed whispered, his voice trembling, his arms tight around her. Lena pressed her face into his wet shirt. "We save each other," she managed to say. They survived, barely. The next day, the sun came out, but it had no warmth at this altitude. They laid their clothes and the blanket on rocks to dry. Reed managed to snare a single squirrel. They ate it raw. The firewood was damp, impossible to light without smoke. They moved higher, deeper into the mountains. The cold was a living thing, a predator that stalked them. On the 4th day after the creek, Lena started to cough. It was a small, dry, hacking sound at first. Reed heard it and his heart stopped. He knew that cough. It was the sound of lungs filling with fluid. The sound of the cold winning. It was lung fever. She weakened with terrifying speed. That evening, she stumbled and fell. When Reed helped her up, her skin was on fire. "No," he muttered, his own panic rising. "No, you do not." She was delirious by morning. She tried to stand and collapsed. Reed was terrified. This was not a bounty hunter. He could not fight this with a pistol. He looked at Lena, her face flushed with fever, her breathing shallow. He remembered Elias, his trapper friend. His lines. He runs his lines in these mountains. He must have a cabin. He put Lena on his stallion. He led the horse, walking, his own leg a rod of hot iron. The mare, weak from hunger, trailed behind. Lena muttered, her head lolling. She spoke of the cold, of water. He walked all day. By dusk, the stallion was stumbling. He could not ask the horse for more. "I am sorry, girl," he whispered to the mare, leaving her tethered in a grassy patch. He lifted Lena from the saddle. She was impossible. She was too light. He wrestled her onto his back, her arms draped over his shoulders. He began to walk, leading the stallion. His world shrank. It became the next step, the pain in his leg, the next breath, the light, hot weight of the woman on his back. He followed the stream, knowing trappers always built near water. He fell. He got up. He fell again. He cursed Vorn, the war, the mountains, and God. He got up again. He walked for a day. He walked through the night, the moon a cold witness. He walked for a second day, and he found it. Tucked into a grove of aspen, almost invisible, was a small, one-room log cabin. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. Reed's pistol was in his hand before he knew it. He was ready to kill Elias, or Vorn's men, or whoever was inside. He kicked the door open, his body braced. It was empty. A fire was banked in the hearth, a bed of coals glowing. Elias must have left that morning to check his traps. There was a cot, a stack of dry wood, a shelf with tins of coffee, dried beans, and salt. Reed did not weep. He had forgotten how. He lowered Lena from his back, his muscles screaming, and laid her on the cot. She was barely conscious. He stripped her of her filthy, still damp clothes. He did not hesitate. This was not about modesty. This was about life. He covered her with the trapper's heavy, dry blankets. He piled wood on the fire until the small cabin was a stifling, dry box of heat. He tended her. He boiled snow for water, forcing it between her cracked lips with a spoon. He boiled the beans into a thin, salty broth and did the same. He sat on a stool by the cot and washed her face with a rag. He sat for a day, a night, another day. She did not wake. She burned. And in her fever, she spoke. She was not in the cabin. She was somewhere else, a hot, terrible place. "No!" she moaned, her head thrashing on the pillow. "No, please, not her! Take me! Please, just take me!" Reed froze, the wet rag in his hand. He leaned closer. "Clara! Oh, God, Clara, my baby! Where is he taking you? Do not let him! Please, my baby!" She was sobbing, a deep, tearing sound that seemed to come from the center of the earth. She was fighting the blankets, her eyes squeezed shut. Reed's chest tightened until he could not breathe. A daughter, a child, lost, sold away when she was captured. This was the darkness behind her eyes. This was the source of her silence, the wound she had carried every step of the way. "They sold her! The preacher! He came and he took her! My Clara! My baby!" He grabbed her hand. It was burning hot and dry as paper. "Lena," he said, his voice urgent. "Lena, it is Reed. You are safe. You are here. I am here." She fought him, her small fist striking his chest. "Let go! I have to get her! Let go!" "I am here," he said, his voice breaking. "I am not leaving. You are safe." He held her hand, held her arms, repeating the words like a prayer, a desperate chant against the ghosts in the room. He held her all through the long, freezing night, the fire painting shadows on the walls. The fever broke at dawn. It did not fade. It vanished. One moment, her skin was fire. The next, it was cool and damp. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, and her body went still. She woke. Her eyes snapped open. They were clear, and they were filled with a stark, animal panic. She saw the unfamiliar log ceiling. She saw the strange room. She saw Reed's face, haggard, unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed. She gasped and tried to scramble back, but she was too weak. Her hand flew to the blankets, clutching them to her throat. She realized, in a flash of horror, that she was naked beneath them. Where am I?" she croaked. "What did you do?" The question was a physical blow. He saw the terror in her eyes. She thought he had while she was helpless. She thought he was just like all the others. The exhaustion and the fear in him curdled into a deep, profound ache. He understood. He understood what her life had taught her to expect. He did not move back. He did not defend himself. He simply held her gaze, his own full of a terrible, gentle honesty. He was still holding her hand, the one he had held all night. "You were sick," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "A fever. From the creek. I carried you here. It is a trapper's cabin. You have been here 2 days." She was still breathing in short, panicked gasps, her eyes darting to the door. He squeezed her hand. "Lena, look at me." Her terrified eyes snapped back to his. "You were never just a body to me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "Not at the auction, not in the barn, and not here. You were never just a thing to be used. Not ever, not to me." She stared into his face. She searched his exhausted, pained eyes. She saw no lie. She saw no lust. She saw the man who had turned his back in the stable. She saw the man who had held her for warmth. She saw the man who had just sat by her side through a deadly fever, listening to her deepest, most private agony. The terror in her eyes did not fade. It shattered. It broke. And behind it was a wave of grief so powerful it shook her. Tears welled and spilled over, running down her temples into her hair. He raised his free hand, his thumb rough from the rains and the cold, and gently, so gently, he brushed a tear from her cheek. She leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement, as a plant leans toward the sun. And then she moved. It took all of her strength. She lifted her head from the cot. She pulled on the hand he was holding. Reed leaned closer, thinking she needed water or broth. "What is it?" She did not answer. She pulled him closer, and she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. Her lips were chapped, dry from the fever. It was tentative for only a second, a soft, uncertain brush. And then it was desperate. It was the kiss of a woman drowning, her hands clutching at the first solid thing she had touched. She grabbed the front of his shirt, her fingers knotting in the cloth, and pulled him down. It was a kiss of pure gratitude, of shared survival, of a loneliness so profound it had nearly killed her. Reed was stunned into stillness. And then all the barriers he had built, the guilt, the shame of his own desire, the fear of being just another man who took, it all crumbled to dust. He kissed her back. He kissed her with the desperation of a man who had been hollow for 5 years. He kissed her with the tenderness of a man who had heard her cry out for her lost child. His arm went under her, lifting her, and his other hand came up to cradle her head. He pulled back, just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. He breathed her name. "Lena." "Do not stop," she whispered, her voice a raw plea. "Please, do not stop." He laid down on the narrow cot beside her, pulling the heavy, rough blankets over them both. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, orange glow over the small room. He touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone. He touched her hair, still damp. His hands were reverent. He was not taking. He was asking, and everywhere he touched, she trembled, not with fever, but with the life. This was not possession. This was a choice, her choice. They made love. It was slow, almost painful in its tenderness. He watched her face in the firelight, his heart pounding, searching for any shadow of fear, any ghost from her past. But there was no fear. There was only need, a need as deep and as fundamental as breathing. And when their bodies joined, it was not a master and a servant. It was not a captor and his prize. It was two broken, solitary souls in a high, cold cabin, clinging to each other as if they were the only two people left in the world. It was slow and tender, and then it was fierce. It was a reclaiming. It was the only true thing either of them had felt in years. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, the cabin silent save for the crackle of the fire. Reed held her, his hand stroking her hair, his heart too full to speak. A sound broke the quiet, a small, choked sob. Lena was weeping. It was not the desperate cry of her fever dream. It was a quiet, profound, heartbreaking sound.
Lena!
Reed's voice was raw with a new panic.
What is it? Did I hurt you?
She turned in his arms, her face wet. She pressed her palm against his rough, unshaven cheek.
No,
she whispered. She took a shuddering breath, her whole body shaking with the force of it. They said, my old master, he said it was bred out of me.
What was? Reed whispered,
his throat tightening.
Love,
she said, her voice catching.
He said we were just animals, that we coupled, but we could not love,
that it was a feeling for white folk, not for us. She closed her eyes, the tears squeezing out. And after they took Clara, I believed him. I thought my heart was dead. It was just a cold, hard stone in my chest. Reed's own eyes burned. He pulled her closer, his embrace suddenly fierce, protective. An oath. He cupped her face, his hands rough, and made her look at him in the firelight. They were wrong, he said, his voice a gravelly, absolute promise. They were wrong. He kissed her forehead. He kissed her eyelids. He kissed the tears from her cheeks. Outside the cabin's single, grimy window, the world had gone silent. The first heavy flakes of snow, white and pure, had begun to fall, covering the tracks, covering the world, burying the past. The snow fell for a week, and the world shrank. It became the four log walls of the trapping cabin, the red-gold glow of the fire, and the small, quiet space that existed only between them. The howling of the wind outside was a distant, mournful sound. A beast kept at bay. The snow piled up, burying the roof, insulating them, sealing them in. It was the safest they had been since the auction block. Lena healed. The fever left her weak, but the broths Reed made from Elias's dried beans and salt, and the meat from 2 rabbits he snared near the stream, brought the strength back to her limbs. The color returned to her face, but it was not just the fever that was healing. The night they had come together had broken something open in both of them. The terrible silence in Lena was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that was no longer freighted with fear. She would watch him as he split wood for the fire, her eyes tracing the line of his shoulders, the way he favored his bad leg. He, in turn, learned her. He learned the sound of her breathing when she was asleep. He learned that she hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when she was tending the fire. And they learned to laugh. It was not a loud thing. It was a small, fragile sound, startled to find itself in the open. The first time, it was when Reed, trying to make biscuits from the trapper's meager flour supply, had produced something closer to a lump of hot stone. He cursed, tossing it onto the hearth, and she had covered her mouth, a small, choked sound escaping her. He looked at her, stunned, and a slow smile spread across his own face. "Not much of a cook, I reckon," he muttered.
No, sir.
she agreed, her eyes bright. You are not. They talked. He told her of the farm in Ohio he had left, of the green, rolling hills that felt like another world, a place he could not imagine returning to. She told him of the smells of the kitchens in Tennessee, of the sweet, heavy scent of magnolia blossoms in the rain. They did not speak of the war. They did not speak of Clara. Not yet. They spoke of the small, simple things that made up a life, the pieces they had left behind. Lena found a small, sharp skinning knife that Elias had left on the shelf. One afternoon, while Reed was outside clearing snow from the animal snares, she took a piece of dry aspen from the woodpile. She sat by the fire, the knife in her hand, and began to carve. Her hands, rough and scarred from work and chains, were surprisingly deft. She worked for hours, the firelight catching the concentration in her face. When Reed returned, stamping snow from his boots, she slipped the piece of wood under her blanket. He did not see, but that night, when he put on his heavy coat to go outside and check the horses in their lean-to, his fingers brushed against something in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a small, smooth piece of wood, no bigger than his thumb. She had carved it into the shape of a bird, its wings half spread, its head turned as if listening. The detail was astonishing. He could almost feel the texture of the feathers. He looked at her. She was watching him, her face full of a shy, vulnerable hope. He did not say anything. He could not. His throat was too thick. He closed his hand around the small bird, the wood warm from her hands, and nodded. He put it back in his pocket, a secret between them. They stayed in the cabin for 8 days. The snow stopped, and a bright, blinding sun returned, turning the world to glittering crystal. They were running low on food. The traps were empty. Elias will be back soon, Reed said, looking out the small, grimy window. He will bring supplies. We can trade him for what we used. He will know the safest way north into Colorado. He sounded confident. He trusted this man. 2 days later, they heard the jingle of a horse's harness. Reed smiled, the first truly relaxed smile Lena had ever seen on his face. That will be him, finally. He pulled the cabin door open, the light flooding in. A man on a shaggy mule was just dismounting. He was young, with a thin, weather-beaten face and a scruffy beard. "Elias," Reed called out, stepping into the snow. "It is about time you came to check your—" Reed stopped. Elias Thorne had his hands up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. And from the trees on either side of the cabin, 4 men stepped out. They all held rifles. They were the men from the trading post, the men from the creek, Vaughn's men.
Reed,
Elias stammered, his voice shaking.
Reed, I did not have a choice. They were at my camp. They found my maps.
You, Reed said, his voice flat and dead. The smile was gone, his face a mask of cold stone. You led them here. He did not just lead us. Carson, said the gaunt man, the one who had confronted Reed at the trading post. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pure white snow. He took the deposit. Smart man. $200 is a lot of money. Reed's hand was a blur. His Colt was out, but he never had a chance. The gaunt man had been waiting for it. He fired his rifle from his hip. The shot was a deafening crack in the cold air. The bullet ripped a chunk of wood from the door frame, inches from Reed's head. Splinters stung his cheek. Get back inside, Reed roared at Lena. He dove back, slamming the heavy wooden door shut, dropping the bar into place just as a volley of bullets hammered against it. The piece was over. The world had found them. There is a back window, Reed said, his voice deadly calm. He was already checking his pistol, his movements fast and economical. A small one, for loading wood. Can you fit? Lena was not panicked. She was cold. She grabbed the small pistol Reed had given her, the one she had practiced with. Yes. They have us pinned. They know we are in here. They will try to burn us out. Or just wait. He looked at the door, which was already splintering. I am not going to wait. He grabbed the heavy table and flipped it on its side, pushing it against the door as a barricade. When I go, you go. Out the window. Get the horses. They are in the lean-to. Go north. Do not stop. Do not wait for me.
No, she said, her voice just as flat as his. I am not leaving you.
That is an order. Lena! I do not take your orders. Reed. Their eyes met. A fierce, desperate clash. He saw the woman from the creek, the one who had screamed his name. Another volley of shots ripped through the single window, shattering the glass. Damn it! Reed crouched, moving to the side. All right. We go together. He peered through a crack in the door. He could see two men, including Elias, hiding behind the horse trough. The gaunt man and another were circling to the back. They are splitting up, he whispered. That is our chance. I will take the door. You watch the window. When I move, you fire. Not to kill, just to make them duck. I understand. Reed took a deep breath. He looked at her one more time, his face grim. Now. He kicked the bar free. He shoved the table and the broken door open and burst out, rolling into the snow, firing his Colt twice at the men by the trough. Elias screamed and dove behind the mule. The other man fired, the shot going high. Now, Lena! Reed yelled, scrambling for the cover of a large pine tree. The gaunt man was rounding the corner of the cabin. He had not expected Lena. He saw Reed, raised his rifle, and took careful aim at Reed's exposed back. Lena was at the window. She saw the man. She saw the cold, murderous intent in his eyes. She remembered Reed's voice. Squeeze, both eyes open. Surprise yourself. She shoved the small pistol through the broken window. She did not aim for his chest. She aimed for the biggest part of him. She squeezed the trigger. The pistol bucked in her hand. The man screamed, a high, thin sound. He dropped his rifle and grabbed his thigh, staggering, a dark stain spreading on his trousers. He fell into the snow, cursing and writhing. The fourth man, seeing his partner down, fired wildly at the window. Lena ducked back as bullets chewed the log above her head. The distraction was all Reed needed. He reached the pine tree, spun, and fired again. The man who had been shooting at him from the trough yelped and dove for cover. Lena, the horses, go! Reed laid down covering fire. 3 quick shots that sent the men scrambling. He ran for the lean-to, grabbing Lena's arm and pulling her with him. The horses were panicked by the gunfire, their eyes wide. Reed slashed their tethers with his knife. Get on! Get on! He threw Lena onto the mare. A bullet grazed his arm. A hot, searing line of pain. He ignored it, swinging onto his stallion. Ride! They burst from the lean-to, 2 desperate shadows against the snow. They rode hard, plunging into the deep woods, ice and wind stinging their faces. They did not look back. They rode for hours, the adrenaline a sick, hot taste in their mouths, until the horses were stumbling and their lungs were on fire. They did not stop until the sun began to set, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Reed's arm was bleeding steadily, a dark patch on his sleeve. They were wounded, desperate, and lost. He finally pulled up, his face pale and drawn. He was swaying in the saddle. We have to stop, he gasped. I am losing too much blood. Lena looked around. They were in a high, wind-swept pass. The trees were sparse. The only features were rocks and snow. There, she said, pointing. Not a cave, a dark opening in the side of the mountain. The black, square outline of a timbered entrance. An abandoned silver mine. They half fell from the horses, dragging the exhausted animals into the dark opening. The mine was a black, cold maw. It smelled of damp rock, cold iron, and something ancient. The wind howled at the entrance, but 10 feet inside, the air was dead and utterly silent. They collapsed against the wall, their breath pluming in the dark. Lena tore a strip of cloth from her skirt and, with shaking hands, tied it around Reed's arm, pulling it brutally tight. He grunted in pain but did not protest. They sat in the absolute darkness. They were at the bottom. They had lost the cabin. They had lost the supplies. They were hunted, wounded, and freezing. The safety they had built, the small, warm world, was gone. Lena began to shake. "It is my fault," she whispered, her voice a dead thing in the black. "No," Reed said, his voice weak. "It was Elias, that son of a—" "No, it is me. Vorn does not want you. He wants me. You got $200 on your head because of me. You should have left me on that block." Reed groped in the dark until his hand found hers. It was ice cold. He gripped it hard. "Do not ever say that. Do you hear me? Ever!" They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere deeper in the mine. "He said her name," Lena said, her voice so quiet he barely heard it. "Who?" My master, in Tennessee, the one who sold me south, after he promised. He said the preacher's family, they were headed for Colorado. He said it to be cruel. He said, 'Your girl is going to Colorado. Lena, you will never see her again.'" Reed heard the story from her fever dream, but now it was clear, sharp, and full of a pain that cut through the darkness. "Clara," Lena whispered, and the name was a prayer. Her name was Clara. She was 3 years old. She had a little ribbon, a blue ribbon. I tied it in her hair that morning, and then the preacher came, and they just took her. She was not crying. Her voice was empty as the mine shaft. This was a grief beyond tears, a piece of her that had been amputated. Reed felt his own loss well up, a familiar, cold stone in his gut. "I had a brother," he said, his voice rough. "His name was Samuel. He was 17. He signed up with me. I told him it would be an adventure. He was at Antietam. He was standing right next to me. A piece of shrapnel. It took his head clean off. I held him. I held what was left." He squeezed her hand. "I am so tired of losing. Lena, I am so tired of running from ghosts." He shifted, his wounded arm sending a jolt of fire through him. He faced her in the dark. "Let's stop running." "What?" "Let's stop running from them," he said, his voice gaining a strange, fierce energy. "Let's start running to something." He heard her sharp intake of breath. What do you mean?" "I mean Clara. Let's go find her." The silence that followed was heavy, taut. "Reed," Lena whispered, and her voice was full of a terrible, fragile fragility. "No, you do not understand. That was years ago. The war, it has been 5 years. More. She was 3. She would be 9 now? 10? She is gone. Reed, she is dead. Or she is lost. Or she has forgotten me. You cannot give me that hope." "Is it hope?" he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Or is it a purpose? You said Colorado, a preacher's family. That is more than nothing. It is a trail. It is a direction. It is better than just waiting for Vorn's men to find us." He felt her tremble. He felt the first flicker of an idea so terrifying, so impossible, that she had never allowed herself to even form the thought. "But Colorado—" "I know the trails. I know how to get there. It is dangerous. It will be cold. And we have nothing, but we are alive. Lena, right now, we are alive. We can keep running from Vorn until he catches us. Or we can go find your daughter." He waited. He could hear her breathing, a ragged, uneven sound. What if we get there?" she whispered. "And there is nothing? What if she is not there?" "Then we will know," he said, "and we will be together, and we will go somewhere else. But we have to try. I am tired of losing. A long, long minute passed. Then he felt her fingers tighten around his, a grip so hard his bones ached. Colorado, she said. Her voice was not strong. It was a flickering, fragile thing, a single candle in a hurricane. But it was there. The preacher. He was with the Methodist Church. He was a tall, thin man. He had a wife who could not have children. That is all I know. It was enough. They stayed in the mine until the first gray light of dawn touched the entrance. They were freezing, starving, and Reed was weak from his wound. But something had changed. The desperate, hunted look in their eyes was gone. Reed got to his feet, pulling Lena up with him. They stood at the mouth of the mine. The storm had passed. The world was a vast, blinding, silent white. A new world. They mounted the horses. Reed looked north, toward the high peaks that marked the pass into Colorado. It was a dangerous trail. It would test everything they had. He looked at Lena. She was watching him, her face pale in the dawn light. He held out his hand. She took it, lacing her cold fingers with his. As they spurred the horses forward, into the rising sun, they were no longer just fugitives. They were no longer a man and his runaway. They were something more. They were two people with a single, impossible purpose. They were going to find Clara. The high passes of the San Juans were a high, white hell. The world was stripped down to three facts: the cold, the wind, and the pain. Reed's arm was a throbbing, infected line of fire. The makeshift bandage Lena had tied in the mine doing little to stop the poison. The purpose that had burned so brightly at the mine entrance was now just a small, guttering coal, barely kept alive against the screaming wind. They had left the mine with two horses, Reed's stallion, a strong, loyal beast, and the mare Lena had ridden. Both were thin, their ribs showing like barrel staves, their breath pluming in the air. The snow was deep, often up to the horses' bellies, and every step was a grueling effort. Lena took charge of the wound. On the second day, she made him stop. She built a small, smoky fire in the lee of a granite boulder, melted snow in their one tin cup, and ripped a clean strip from the hem of her skirt. "This will hurt," she said, her voice flat. She had unwrapped the bloody rag. The wound was dark, the edges swollen and purple. "Just do it," he hissed, his face pale and beaded with sweat. She washed it with the scalding water, her touch firm, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. She bound it tightly, her hands quick and sure. She was the one holding him together. They pushed on. The cold was a chisel, and the wind was a hammer, shaping them into something new, something brittle and hard. They ate nothing. They chewed on pine needles to trick their stomachs. At night, they did not sleep in a bedroll. They slept in a hole, dug in the snow. The one remaining soaked blanket pulled over both of them, the horses standing nearby as a windbreak. They clung to each other, not in passion, but like two freezing orphans in a storm. Their first great loss came at the Animas River. It was not a gentle river. It was a black, churning artery of half-frozen water and jagged plates of ice, rushing through a deep canyon. The only way north was to cross it. Reed scouted for an hour, his bad leg dragging. He found what looked like a shallow ford, where the water spread wide. "Here," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have to be fast." He went first, his stallion fighting the current, the ice breaking and slamming against its legs. He made it to the other side, the horse scrambling up the bank, trembling and snorting in terror.
"Now, Lena, keep her head up."
Lena urged the mare into the water. The animal was weaker, its spirit already broken by the journey. It took 3 steps, stumbled as a large sheet of ice struck its chest, and then its back legs went out from under it. The horse gave a high, terrible scream as the current caught it, rolling it onto its side. Lena was thrown clear. She vanished under the black water.
"Lena!"
Reed's roar was lost in the river's noise. He plunged back into the water, his wounded arm useless, his boots filling with ice. He saw her head surface, gasped for air, and then was pulled under again. He lunged, his good hand grabbing a handful of her hair in her coat. He got his feet under him, felt the slick stones, and roared with a primal, desperate strength. He dragged her, choking and sputtering, toward the bank. The mare was gone, swept downstream, a dark shape tumbling in the ice. Lena collapsed on the snowy bank. She was not breathing. "No," Reed said. "No, I did not come this far." He turned her over, put his mouth over hers, and breathed. He did not know where he had seen it. A camp doctor, maybe. He breathed again, and pounded on her back. She choked, a violent rattling sound, and a lungful of icy water poured from her mouth. She coughed, writhed, and then lay still, her body seized by a convulsive, silent shivering. He had no choice. He stripped her of the soaking, frozen clothes, his hands numb, his mind a cold, blank sheet of terror. He stripped his own wet shirt off. He pulled the one dry blanket from his saddle, wrapped her in it, and then wrapped his own body around hers, skin to skin, trying to force his life, his warmth, into her. "Stay," he whispered, his mouth against her hair. "Stay with me. Lena, stay." She lived, but the mare was gone. Their journey changed. It slowed. Now there was only one horse. Reed's stallion, already half dead, had to carry their dwindling supplies, and, at times, both of them, it was too much. They walked. They walked through snowdrifts so deep they had to crawl. Reed would walk for an hour, his leg on fire. Then Lena would walk. Then, on a high, wind-blasted plateau, the stallion simply stopped. It stood, its head hung low. It would not be beaten. It would not be coaxed. It had given everything. Reed laid his hand on its neck. It was trembling, its life fading. "Good boy," he whispered. He took his knife. He could not let it freeze. They left it. They took the saddlebags, the blanket, and the bridle, and they walked. They were two small, dark figures in a world of blinding white. They walked for 4 days, on feet wrapped in rags, fueled only by the single, impossible idea of Clara. They stumbled into the outskirts of Denver not as travelers, but as ghosts. They were ragged, skeletal, and covered in filth. Reed's coat was stiff with old blood. Lena's borrowed gray dress was torn to ribbons. People saw them and crossed the street. Children pointed. A constable looked at them, spat, and turned away. The city was a shock. After the profound silence of the mountains, the noise was a physical assault. The rumble of wagons, the shouting of men, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the thick, acrid smell of coal smoke and sewage. They had nothing, no money, no food, no friends, just the clothes on their backs. That first night, they huddled in a dark alley between a saloon and a tannery, the stench choking them, the blanket pulled over their heads. "We need a room," Reed said, his voice a low rasp. We need to be clean." He looked at Lena. Her face was gaillard, her eyes sunken. She was watching a rat moving in the shadows. He stood up. He had one thing left. He walked to a brightly lit street and found a pawn shop. The sign showed 3 gold balls. Inside, a man with a gray, suspicious face looked him up and down. "What?" Reed said nothing. He unbuckled his gun belt. He laid the heavy Colt revolver on the glass counter. The gun was his life. It was his arm. It was the only part of the soldier he had left. The man behind the counter saw the look on his face. He picked up the gun, checked the action. Union Army, heavy, worn. He looked at Reed. $10. "It is worth 50. $10, or you can leave." Reed's hand twitched. He wanted to reach across, to take the man by the throat. Instead, he just nodded. The man counted out $10 in coins and paper. Reed scooped it up. He returned to the alley. Lena looked at his empty hip. Her eyes widened. She understood what he had done. She said nothing. She just took his hand. He got them a room. It was in a boarding house, in an attic, a space so small they could not both stand at once. It had a leaking skylight and a narrow cot, but it had a door that locked. He spent $1 on a loaf of stale bread, a small wedge of cheese, and a bar of lye soap. They took turns at the small wash basin, scrubbing away the grime of the mountains, the blood, and the despair. It was a baptism. Then they began the search. Reed bought Lena another dress from a second-hand stall. It was a dark, functional wool, the kind a maid would wear. It was the only way she could move through the city without being arrested. The anonymity of the wilderness was gone. Here, they were their colors. He was a broken-down white drifter. She was a colored woman, and therefore a servant. They went to the Methodist Church headquarters. A tall woman with a face like a hatchet stopped Lena at the door.
"Deliveries are in the back alley. Girl,"
she said, not even looking up from her ledger.
"She is with me,"
Reed said, stepping forward. The woman looked up, her gaze taking in Reed's limp, his ragged clothes, and then Lena, standing behind him, her lip curled in a silent, profound disgust. It was a look Lena knew well. It was the look that said she was a contamination. "We are looking for church records," Reed said, his voice hard. "From 1864, 1865. The public records are in the basement. I have no time to assist you." For a week, they sat in a cold, damp basement, turning the pages of heavy, moldering books, orphanage arrivals, baptismal certificates, church registries. The name Clara was everywhere. Clara Smith, Clara Johnson, Clara Brown. None were the right age. None had come from Tennessee. They looked for the preacher, but Lena did not know his name. The city was crushing Lena. In the wilderness, she had been Reed's equal. She had been a survivor. Here, she was nothing. When she walked down the street, white women pulled their skirts away from her, as if she carried a disease. Men looked at her, their eyes lingering, a silent calculation in their gaze. She was mistaken for a laundress, a cook, someone's property. The weight of it, the silence, the constant, grinding dismissal. It was heavier than the snow, colder than the river. The $10 ran out. Reed found work, day labor, hauling ice, his legs screaming. It was enough for bread. It was not enough for hope. The breaking point came one night, back in the tiny attic room. It was snowing again, the flakes melting on the dirty skylight. Lena had been silent all day, after being shoved off the sidewalk by a drunken cowboy. She sat on the cot, her hands twisting in the lap of her gray servant's dress. She began to shake. "Lena," Reed said, sitting beside her.
"What if I dreamed her?"
she whispered, her voice a thin, cracked sound. "What?" She looked at him, her eyes wide and full of a darkness he had not seen since the auction block. "Clara, what if she was not real? What if I just made her up?" She grabbed his shirt, her knuckles white. "Maybe I am crazy. Maybe the fever burned my mind out. What if I never had a daughter? What if I just dreamed her? So I had something to live for? What if I am just what he said I was, just an animal, broken in the head?" She collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs. It was not the healing cry of the cabin. It was the sound of a soul tearing apart. Reed held her. He held her tightly, as he had at the river, as if he could hold her together by force. He let her cry, rocking her, his own face a mask of pain. When the sobs quieted to shudders, he put his hand under her chin and made her look at him. "She is real," he said, his voice rough. "Your memory is real. Your love for her is real. That is the one thing they cannot take from you. That is the one thing that is not a dream." He held her gaze. "If she is alive, we will find her. If she is not, then we will remember her. Together. We will build a life. You and me, and we will remember her. But we are not done. I am not done. Not yet. He had one last idea. He had heard of a retired preacher, an old man who had run the circuit for 30 years. He was the one who kept the real records, the ones in his head. They found him in a small, clean house at the edge of town. He was an old man, frail, with hands that shook, but his eyes were clear and kind. They sat in his parlor. Lena, her voice trembling, told the story. Tennessee, a preacher named Josiah Goodnight, a barren wife, a little girl named Clara, 1864. The old man's eyes, which had been distant, suddenly focused. "Goodnight," he whispered. "Yes, I remember him. A zealous man, full of fire. His wife, Elspeth, a sad, quiet woman. They came through here. They had a child with them, a little colored girl. They said they had saved her. I remember, because they left the church." Lena's hand flew to her mouth. "Left?" Reed asked. "Yes, they were farmers. They said Denver was a city of sin. They took their wagon, their child, and they went east, out onto the plains. Said they were going to build a new life, a pure life, somewhere near the big sandy creek. A name, a place. It was not a dream." They left the old man's house, walking back into the snowy streets. Lena was walking, but she felt as if she were floating. They had to get there. Reed sold his coat, the heavy sheepskin one, for $5. He used the money to buy a broken-down mule, one with a missing ear and a sway back. It came with a worn-out saddle. He bought a sack of oats, 2 blankets, and a rifle, a cheap, rusty single-shot, but it was a gun. They rode out of Denver the next morning, under a pale, watery dawn. They were back to the old rhythm. One rode the mule, the other walked beside it. The city fell away, and the great white, empty plains of eastern Colorado opened up before them. It was a vast, terrifying ocean of snow, but it was not empty. It held a purpose. That night, they made camp under a star-filled sky so cold it seemed to crackle. Reed took his knife. He sat by the fire, looking at the worn, cracked horn of the saddle. Slowly, he began to carve. L-E-N-A. The letters were deep, cut into the leather, permanent. Lena watched him. When he was done, he ran his thumb over the name. He looked at her, his face lit by the small fire. "You are mine," he whispered, his voice thick. She stiffened. The word was a chain. He saw it. He reached out, touching her cheek. "If you still want to be—" He was not claiming her. He was asking to belong to her. He was anchoring himself. She touched the rough letters on the saddle. She understood. She nodded. A single, slow movement. They traveled for 2 more days, following the frozen line of the creek. A blizzard hit them, a wall of white, and they were lost. The mule near collapse. They stumbled upon a light. It was a sod house, a dugout, half buried in the snow, a refuge. Reed knocked. The door opened. A woman stood there, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes tired but kind. She was a widow, her husband taken by the prairie. She looked at Reed, a hard-bitten white man. She looked at Lena, a black woman, half frozen. She looked at the mule. "Get inside," she said, her voice firm. "The Lord will sort us all out in the morning. Tonight, we are just souls in a storm." She gave them hot, thin stew and bread. She had only one bed, a rope cot with a feather mattress. "You two take it," she said, pointing. "I will sleep by the fire. You look like you have come from the end of the world." They did not argue. They went to the small, curtained-off alcove. They could hear the wind howling outside, a terrible, lonely sound. But inside, it was warm. It was safe. They lay down on the mattress. It was soft. They were clean. They were fed. Reed turned to her, He did not touch her with the desperate, healing need of the cabin. He touched her face, his thumb stroke-psyching her cheek.
"Lena,"
he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were clear. There was no fear. There was no ghost. There was only him. They made love. It was slow. It was tender. It was a promise, a confirmation. It was not the desperate clutching of two survivors. It was the quiet, deliberate touch of two people who had chosen each other. Afterward, he held her, his heart full, the silence of the room peaceful. He waited, half expecting the tears, the echo of her grief. She was still. Then she turned in his arms, pressing her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. "I can love," she whispered. It was a discovery, a fact, like finding she had been carrying a gold coin all along. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dark. "And I do, you," the words spoken in the sod house, "I can love, and I do, you," settled over them, a benediction as sacred as any prayer. They left the widow's home at dawn, her kindness a small, warm coal in their chests. She had given them a sack of flour and a side of bacon. Refusing any payment, "The Lord provides," she had said. "And sometimes he uses strangers' hands." They followed the frozen, meandering line of the big sandy creek, the world a vast, empty sheet of white. The hope that had been a fragile, terrifying thing in Denver was now a sharp, focused point, a needle drawing them east. Lena, who had been hollowed out by her past, now felt a new, unfamiliar tension. It was not just hope. It was fear. Fear that the end of this journey would be a greater desolation than the one she had already endured. Reed felt her silence. He did not press her to speak. He just walked beside the mule when it was her turn to ride, his hand resting on her knee. A steady, physical anchor in a world of ghosts and possibilities. After 2 days of following the creek, they saw it. The old preacher in Denver had been right. It was a farmstead, but it looked more like a fortress against the prairie. It was built in a shallow dip, sheltered from the wind by a small stand of cottonwoods. There was a sturdy log house, a large barn, and corrals. Smoke, thin and white, rose from the stone chimney. Lena stopped. She slid off the mule, her legs unsteady. Reed stopped with her. He put his hand on her shoulder. "Lena? It is them," she whispered. She did not know how she knew. She just felt it. A cold, heavy certainty in her gut. "Josiah, good night." "All right," Reed said, his voice low. He scanned the farmstead. There were no other houses, no roads, just this, isolated in the white. "We walk, slow. I will talk first." She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They led the mule. 2 worn travelers approaching the house. The farmstead was quiet. There was no one in the yard. A dog, a large black hound, came from under the porch and barked once. A deep thrall underscore and underscore us underscore fina underscore 1 underscore p underscore 0.mdati sound. Then stood, its tail moving in a slow, uncertain wag. Reed stopped at the porch steps. "Hello, the house," he called out. The door opened. An elderly man stood there, silhouetted against the warm light. He was tall, just as Lena had remembered, but bent now. His hair a wild shock of white. His face was severe, carved with lines of piety and hard work. It was Josiah Goodnight. Behind him, a small, frail woman appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. "Elspeth." "Can we help you, mister?" Josiah's voice was deep, but it trembled with age. "Sir," Reed said, his voice respectful. He took off his hat. "My name is Reed. This is Lena. We are traveling north. We are looking for a family, a preacher's family, who came this way from Tennessee near on 10 years ago. We were told you might be them." Josiah Goodnight's face hardened. His eyes moved from Reed, a hard-looking man with a limp and a cheap rifle, to Lena. He stared at her, and his eyes, which had been wary, filled with a sudden, cold recognition. He took a step back.
Elspeth,
he said, his voice sharp.
go inside.
No, Lena said. The word was a gasp, torn from her. She stepped forward, past Reed, her eyes locked on the old man. You remember me?
I do not know you,
Josiah stammered, but his gaze faltered. You do, Lena said, her voice shaking but gaining a desperate strength. You came to the Hatcher plantation. You took my daughter. Elspeth Goodnight let out a small, broken sound, like a dying bird. She put her hand to her mouth. You have no right, Josiah said, his voice rising, taking on the old fire of the pulpit. We saved her. We saved that child from a life of... Where is she? Lena's voice cut through his. She was not begging. She was not asking. She was a mother, and her voice was a weapon. Where is my Clara?
You must leave,
Josiah said, stepping forward.
You are trespassing. You are a runaway. I know what you are. You have no claim. Where is she?
Lena cried, and this time her voice broke.
Papa?
The voice came from the shadows of the house. A girl stepped into the doorway, standing beside Elspeth. She was tall for her age, almost 12. She was thin, in a simple, homespun dress, her dark hair pulled back in 2 neat braids. She had Lena's eyes, wide, dark, and full of a cautious, guarded light. She was beautiful. Lena's breath left her body. The world, the cold, Reed, the old man, it all vanished. There was only this face she had seen every night in her dreams, a face she had sketched in her mind, aged year by year. Lena sank to her knees. She did not fall. She sank, as if her bones had turned to water. She put her hands on the rough wood of the porch, her shoulders heaving. She could not speak. She could not breathe. She just stared. The girl, Clara, looked at her. Her face was a mask of confusion. She looked at the strange, weeping black woman on her porch. She looked at the old man she called Papa, his face a thundercloud of anger and fear. She looked at the kind woman she called Mama, who was weeping silently into her apron. And then her gaze settled on Lena. She tilted her head, a small, bird-like movement. She was looking at a ghost, at a half-remembered dream. Reed watched, his heart in his throat. He put his hand on his rifle, not to threaten, but as an anchor.
Clara took one step, then another.
She stepped past Josiah, onto the porch. She looked down at Lena. There was a faint, white scar, shaped like a crescent moon, just below Lena's left eye. Clara's gaze fixed on it, a memory, a flash of a woman's face, leaning over a cot, singing a low song, a blue ribbon, a touch. Mama? The word was a whisper, a question. Lena let out a sound, a sob that was ripped from the deepest part of her. She raised one, shaking hand.
Clara,
she breathed. Clara's cautious face crumpled. The guard she had lived with her whole life, the wall of a child raised in silence and piety. It all fell away. Mama? She launched herself from the porch, falling into Lena's arms. Lena grabbed her, clutching her, her face buried in her daughter's hair. She was memorizing her, the smell of her skin, the feel of her thin shoulders. She was rocking, back and forth, on her knees in the snow, making a low, keening sound of both agony and joy. She was home.
My baby,
Lena wept, her words muffled.
My baby.
They did not get you. You are here.
I thought you were dead.
Clara cried, her arms locked around Lena's neck.
Papa, he said you were gone. He said you were with the angels. I am here,
Lena said, pulling back to look at her, her hands cupping her daughter's face.
I am here.
Reed turned away, his own eyes burning. He gave them the moment. He looked at Josiah Goodnight. The old man's face was a ruin of conflict, of shame and righteousness. That night, they sat in the small, clean parlor. The tension was so thick it was hard to breathe. Elspeth, her eyes red, had made a stew. She had fussed over Clara and Lena, seating them side by side, her hands fluttering, unable to stop touching Clara's hair. Josiah sat in his chair by the fire, his Bible in his lap, unopened. She is a good girl," Elspeth said, her voice trembling. "She reads the good book. She is a comfort to us. She is my daughter," Lena said. Her voice was quiet, but the steel was back. She had not let go of Clara's hand since she had found her.
We saved her,"
Josiah said, his voice rough.
"That man, Hatcher, he was a brute. He was going to sell her to a house in New Orleans. We paid for her. We took her. We gave her a good, godly life. We gave her a home."
"You stole her," Lena said, her voice shaking with a cold fury.
"You told her I was dead."
"It was a kindness," Josiah insisted, standing up. "To let her live in hope of finding a runaway, a woman lost to the world. It would have been a cruelty. We gave her peace." "You lied," Lena said.
"Enough,"
Reed said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room. "What is done is done. The question is, what happens now?" Josiah looked at him. "What happens now? She is our daughter. We have raised her. The law is on our side. This woman, she is a fugitive. She has no papers. She has no claim. She is, by the law of the land, still the property of Caleb Vaughan." Lena's blood ran cold. She had forgotten. In the joy of finding Clara, she had forgotten Vaughan.
She belongs with me,"
Lena said, her voice desperate. "And where will you go?" Elspeth asked, her voice full of a genuine, tearful fear. "Back to that life. They will find you. They will take her and you. They will separate you again. Is that what you want? To give her to him? Is that why you came?" Lena looked at Clara. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes wide with a new terror. She was looking from the woman she knew as Mama to the woman she now knew was her Mama. Lena was trapped. To stay was impossible. To run with a child was impossible. Vaughan's shadow was long. It had reached all the way here. Reed, who had been silent, finally spoke. "No," he said. "That is not what is going to happen." He looked at Lena. "She will not be a runaway, and she will not be property." He turned to Josiah. "You are a preacher, or you were. You can still perform a marriage. Can you not?" Josiah stared, uncomprehending. "What?" "A marriage," Reed said. "Between me and Lena. Right here, tonight. You will sign the certificate. You will date it 2 years ago. In Denver. You will sign it as the officiating minister." I will not," Josiah sputtered. "It is a lie. It is a sin, and it is against the law of God and man." "Is it?" Reed said, his voice dangerously soft. "Is it more of a sin than stealing a child? Is it more of a sin than telling her that her mother was dead?" He took a step closer. "You will do this. You will do this, or I will ride to the nearest town, and I will tell the marshal that you are harboring a runaway, and that you have been for 10 years. You stole property. Old man, they will hang you, and they will send Lena and Clara both back south." Josiah's face went pale. He knew Reed was right. It was checkmate. "You would not," he whispered. "I would," Reed said. "To keep her safe. I would." He turned to Lena. Her face was a storm. She was looking at him, her eyes wide, unreadable. "Reed," she began. "It is the only way," he said, his voice softening. "A marriage certificate. You would be Lena Carson, a free woman, my wife. You would not be a runaway. Vaughan's claim would be void. They would be hunting a ghost. We can get new names. We can go somewhere no one knows us. I know a place. A valley. In the high country. I scouted it once. Hard to find. Good water. We can build a cabin. We can homestead. He was offering her a life, a new name, a new world. But Lena was shaking her head. She looked from Reed, his face earnest and desperate, to Clara, her hand still in hers. No, she whispered. Reed's face fell. Lena?
No,
She said, her voice stronger. She stood up, pulling Clara with her.
I cannot. I just found me. I was a slave. Then I was a runaway. Then I was just Lena. I cannot be owned again.
Lena, Reed said, his heart breaking. It would not be.
A wife is owned,
She said, the words bitter, torn from her.
by law, by God. She belongs to her husband. I cannot. Reed, I love you, but I cannot trade one master for another, even if he is a kind one. I cannot. She was afraid. She was terrified of the cage, even if the door was open.
Reed looked at her, at the raw, honest terror in her face. He had offered her a trap, thinking it was a key. He took a step toward her. He did not touch her. You are right, he said, his voice quiet and full of a respect that was deeper than any passion they had shared. You would be Mrs. Carson, but you would not be mine. He waited until her eyes met his. You are not mine, Lena. You never were. Not from the moment I took you from Vorn. I am not him. I am not them. He held her gaze, his heart in his eyes. You are not mine. Not unless you choose to be. This is not me owning you. This is me asking to be yours. This is me, and you, and Clara. A family. You would not be my property. You would be my partner. You would be my wife. Lena searched his face. She saw the man who had given her his blanket, the man who had held her while she wept, the man who had walked through a blizzard to find her daughter. She saw a man who was not taking, but offering. She looked at Clara, who was hiding behind her skirts, staring at this strange, intense man. She took a long, shuddering breath. She let go of Clara's hand. She stepped forward, closing the small space between her and Reed. She put her hand on his chest, where his heart was beating, a hard, steady rhythm.
Yes,
She whispered.
I choose to be.
Josiah Goodnight, his face pale and his hands shaking, performed the ceremony. He wrote out the marriage certificate on a piece of parchment, his hand scratching in the ledger. He dated it 2 years prior. He and Elspeth signed as witnesses. When it was done, Lena took the paper. She was Lena Carson. It felt strange. It felt solid. Before they left, Elspeth came to Lena, her hands full. It was a small, wooden box. Inside were Clara's things, the dress she had arrived in, a small, beaded necklace, and a single, faded blue ribbon. Lena took it, her hands trembling. Then, from her own pocket, Elspeth pulled something else. It was heavy and dark. It was a single, rusted iron shackle, the one Lena had worn on her wrist at the auction block.
He Mr.
Vorn's man, Elspeth whispered. It was with her things. He said it was to remind her of who she was. Josiah, he kept it, as a symbol of her bondage and her salvation. Lena looked at the heavy, cold iron, the symbol of her past. She had thought she was free of it. She took it from Elspeth. That night, they burned it. Reed, Lena, and Clara stood at the fireplace. Lena held the iron shackle over the flames. It was not a collar, but it was her chain. She held it until the heat scorched her fingers, and then she let it drop. The three of them watched as the fire licked at it, as the metal glowed dull red, as the past was burned, but not forgotten. Months later, the world was green. The valley Reed had spoken of was a secret, tucked high in the mountains, a bowl of meadow grass and clear water, surrounded by aspen and pine. The law could not find them here. Cruelty could not find them here. Reed, His limp more pronounced but his arms strong, was building a cabin. The sound of his axe echoed in the clean air. He was teaching Clara how to fish with a line and a bent pin. Her laughter, a sound Lena was learning for the first time, was like the stream, bright and fast. Lena had a garden. She had her hands in the dark, rich earth, planting beans and squash, and the earth did not fight her. It gave. One night, the cabin half-built, they sat outside under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled salt. Clara was asleep inside their tent, clutching the small, carved bird Reed had made for her, a partner to the one in his own pocket. Lena sat beside Reed, her head on his shoulder. It was quiet, the profound, peaceful quiet of a place that was truly home. She pressed her palm to his chest, feeling the steady, slow beat of his heart. They were wrong, she whispered again, the words a familiar, healing prayer. They were so wrong. A slave can love. Reed turned, his rough hand cupping her face. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that held the memory of the desert, the cold of the river, and the warmth of the sod house. He pulled back, his eyes clear and full of a love that was as vast as the sky above them. "And be loved," he answered, his voice a low, gentle promise. "All night long." Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your feelings on Lena and Reed's journey.